ever go to a funeral where the minister forgot the service? Did you? When the man next to you died and they threw him overboard, all your thought was, oh, there'll be more water to drink. You didn't even care that he was dead.
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. So please subscribe when you're finished listening. You can also go to classicmovierev.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is Dark Waters, 1944. The movie is hailed as a Gothic Film Noir, and I just had to see it. Dark Waters 1944 was directed by André De Toth. The film is rated 6.5 on imdb.com, and with no tomato meter percentage, this movie is only liked by 40% of the audiences. It's better than that. Here's a quote that I really like by Glenn Heath Jr., Slant Magazine's film critic, who said, quote, "Mood dictates narrative in André De Toth's Dark Waters, a hallucinatory jigsaw puzzle set in the deep swamps of 1940s Louisiana that becomes a perfect breeding ground for noirish shadows and deceptive wordplay. Dark Waters ends with multiple dead bodies sinking into the bayou, and Leslie directly confronting what one character calls her persuasion complex. The bravois finale through the oozing locale is a stunner, and despite some surface romance that feels a bit forced, the film stays true to its mystical dark mood, a slithering distant cousin to Tourneur's I Walked with a Zombie, date added 1943. We will look at whether this is a film noir or not at the end, so let's move on to the actors.
Right, and I'm a Shakespearean actor.
We have a strong crop of returning cast, beginning with Thomas Mitchell, who was first covered in episode 53, It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. Mitchell played the role of Mr. Sidney, a shady character. Elisha Cook Jr. played the very creepy Cleve. Did he play anything else? Cook was first covered in episode 100, The Maltese Falcon, 1941. John Quallen was in the role of Quiet Uncle Norbert. Quallen was first discussed in episode 66, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962. Rex Ingram had a small but important role as fired plantation worker Pearson Jackson. Ingram was first covered in episode 25, Sahara, 1943. Alan Napier played an uncredited and unnamed doctor. I only mention him because he was the butler Alfred on Batman 1966-68. Napier was covered in episode 82, Big Jim McLean, 1952. Merle Oberon played the submarine attack survivor Leslie Calvin. This beauty was born in Bombay, now Mumbai, India, in 1911. Her father was English and her mother was from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Using her birth name, Estelle Queenie Thompson was educated in India until she was 17, at which time she moved to London. For about 3 years she played a series of bit parts. Finally she was given a larger role in Men of Tomorrow, 1932, and then a major role in The Private Lives of Henry VIII, 1933. It was for this second role that she changed her name from Queenie Thompson to Merle Oberon. Following her role in The Scarlet Pimpernel, 1934, she was called to Hollywood. By the time she was in America, she had another British film hit with Vagabond Violinist, 1932. She did very well in the 1930s, including a role in The Dark Angel, 1935, which led to her Oscar nomination as Best Actress. She did not win, but she is still the only Asian woman to have been nominated in this category. As a side note, early on she was presented as being from Tasmania, Australia. She even introduced her mother, who lived with her, as the maid. Other important movies during this period include These Three, 1936, Over the Moon, 1939, The Divorce of Lady X, 1938, Wuthering Heights, 1939. The 1940s were very good to her and she appeared in 15 films. These films include wartime fare such as First Comes Courage, 1943, suspense like The Lodger, 1944, and Gothic Film Noir such as Dark Waters, 1944. After Berlin Express, 1948, her film roles began to slow. Her later films include The Lady from Boston, 1951, Desiree, 1954, Of Love and Desire, 1963, and finally Interval, 1973. She retired and lived until 1979, when she died of a stroke at the relatively young age of 68. Franchot Tone played Dr. George Grover. Tone was born in Niagara Falls in 1905. Tone's family was wealthy and he attended the Hill School in Pennsylvania before graduating to Cornell University. He graduated in 1927 and then became very active in theater. He made his Broadway debut in 1929. He later joined the Group Theater in New York under Lee Strasberg. In 1932, he made the move to Hollywood. His first film was The Wiser Sex, 1932. He made Today We Live, 1933, where he met his future wife, Joan Crawford. Tone was more interested in theater than Hollywood. This led to his first divorce and his slow relegation to second leading man. He still had important roles such as in The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, 1935, and Mutiny on the Bounty, 1935, with Clark Gable and Charles Lawton. Since all three of these men were nominated for the Best Actor Oscar for the same film, the category of Best Supporting Actor was created. Tone jumped back and forth between stage and screen. He began producing his own films, and some of the notables are Phantom Lady, 1944, and the film noir The Man on the Eiffel Tower, 1950, which was directed by his friend Burgess Meredith. After his second divorce, Tone became involved with and married actress Barbara Payton. Payton was on a downward slide that would eventually lead to homelessness and prostitution. Tone was beaten by another boyfriend of hers, B actor Tom Neal. This marriage only lasted a few weeks. Through the 1950s, Tone worked in television and theater. He returned to the screen and did a great job as the dying president in Advise and Consent, 1962, which was directed by Otto Preminger. His final film was Nobody Runs Forever, 1968. Tone died in 1968. Story.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
The movie begins with a newspaper run showing that the wealthy daughter of a Batavian oil man had survived a Nazi submarine attack and is in New Orleans. First, where's Batavia? Probably the Dutch East Indies. And second, damn Nazis. Leslie Calvin, Merle Oberon, is a little crazy from the experience of being sunk and surviving in a lifeboat for a long time as people starved and died.
Did you ever go to a funeral where the minister forgot the service? Did you? When the man next to you died and they threw him overboard, and all you thought was, oh, there'll be more water to drink. You didn't even care that he was dead. The sailor got up and said, oh God, we consign the soul to your keeping and the body to thee. And he couldn't remember anymore. And someone beside you said, deep. And then someone was high.
She's under the care of an unnamed doctor, Alan Napier, of Batman fame. Dang, Alfred was a good-looking dude when he was young. The doctor asks what her plans are. The only relatives she has are her mother's sister, Aunt Emily, Fay Bainter, and her husband, Uncle Norbert, John Quallen. The doctor writes to their New York address for Leslie. After some time, a letter comes from her aunt and uncle with a postmark from Belleville, Louisiana. Her aunt and uncle are at a rural plantation called Rossignol. They invite Leslie to come and stay with them. It's about 90 miles from New Orleans. Leslie takes the train to Belleville, but no one is waiting to pick her up. The station manager tells her that the plantation is on Bayou Grande Terre, but no one has heard of her aunt and uncle. She waits at the station for a while, but eventually passes out from heat and stress. When she awakes, she is being tended by a young, handsome Dr. George Grover, Franchot Tone. She wants to go back, but George says he will take her out to the plantation. Leslie waits at George's office, and he knows about her case from reading the stuff in her purse. She tells him about the sinking and the time in the lifeboat. George drives Leslie out to the plantation and says he will drop by and see her every day or so. In a flirty way, not medically speaking. When they get to the big house, they are met by the property manager, Mr. Sidney, Thomas Mitchell. Leslie says she sent a telegram, but Mr. Sidney says he doesn't know anything about it. She meets her Aunt Emily and Uncle Norbert. Norbert is an odd bird and very preoccupied with his hobby. Leslie hears the phone ring, and her aunt says it's not listed under their name. Before George leaves, he tells Mr. Sidney that Leslie is in a very fragile condition and should be taken care of. When Aunt Emily takes Leslie to the room, it has not been cleaned, and she says if she had only known she was coming. Emily blames it on the maid, Florella, Nina Mae McKinley. Emily is very concerned with pleasing Mr. Sidney, even though he works for her and Norbert. Downstairs, Mr. Sidney is chewing out Florella for the place being dirty. He then throws the telegram from Leslie in the trash. Aha! At dinner that night, Leslie meets Cleve, Elisha Cook Jr., a helper. Mr. Sidney hears talking in the kitchen and calls Florella out. She says it's just Pearson Jackson, Rex Ingram. Mr. Sidney chastises Florella and says Pearson is not allowed on the property. They grill Leslie for details of the war and the sinking. Eventually she breaks down and runs to her room. Later, Mr. Sidney and Cleve take Leslie on a tour of the plantation.
Made their own sugar right here on the place in the old days. The bayou was part of the river.
Shallow enough to wade in some places, very deep in others. Quite dangerous.
Only last year a woman went under the quicksand. We heard her hollering, but by the time we got there she was gone. She had been carrying a wash basket, and there it was, right where she went down, marking the spot.
Of course, they talk about the quicksand and how dangerous it is outside. Cleve gets a little sexually aggressive towards Leslie and tries to get her into the boat. George shows up just in time to break up the boat trip. She goes and spends the day with George while he's making house calls. They go to the Boudreaux house, and Leslie is very relaxed around the big Cajun family. They are invited to a big Cajun fête au dos, a big public dance, the next night at the Boudreaux house. George accurately says fête au dos means little one go to sleep. In other words, let the adults party while the children are asleep. George drops Leslie off, and she is told by Mr. Sidney that they are going to the movies. It's just Leslie, Mr. Sidney, and Cleve. Of course, the movie tone news showing submarine warfare upsets Leslie again. That night she begins to hear creaking in the old house. A lamp by the bed turns itself on and off. Leslie screams for Emily, who comes to her aid. Emily gaslights her pretty good and says it's just a screen door. The next morning, Pearson Jackson comes to talk to Leslie. He asks her to find out why he was fired after 12 years when her aunt and uncle came to the plantation. He says Cleve keeps running him off. Leslie says she will find out. When Cleve drives up, Pearson runs away. Later that afternoon, Leslie is taking a nap, like all good Southern girls do. When she wakes up, Mr. Sidney's in her room. He says he was checking on her and brings her an egg and sherry. A what? According to SavoyStomp.com, it's a raw egg with an unbroken yolk and 2 to 3 ounces of sherry. I'm not really sure if it's for curing a hangover or starting you on the way to the worst one ever. That night, Leslie ends up eating the food Florella made for her in the kitchen. Florella insists that Leslie go to the fête au dos. George shows up, and the others try to keep Leslie from going to the dance. Leslie rears up and decides to go against the crowd's wishes. Leslie and George have a good time at the party, dancing and such. There's some fine Cajun music and dancing in this movie. As they talk, Leslie mentions that her mother was an invalid from birth.
You certainly took to that square dancing as if you'd lived here all your life.
Thank you.
Mama Boudreaux said you must have been born dancing.
Oh, no, not until I was 3. I used to dance for my mother.
She taught you?
No, Mother never danced. She was an invalid. She never walked from the time she was a child. My father always carried her. She used to say that my feet would have to do all the dancing for the 2 of us.
Well, she couldn't have made a better choice.
George then kisses her and starts talking about marriage. Wait, it's a little early. And what about the doctor-patient thing? Anyway, Leslie freaks and runs into the house, vowing to never see George again. Leslie tells Aunt Emily that she can't marry anyone because she thinks she's crazy. She also says she wants to marry him, but thinks she should be dead like her parents. She runs into her room but hears a voice calling. She asks Emily if she called, but is told no. She goes out onto the balcony and hears someone calling her name in the distance. She goes downstairs and out into the swamp where she has been told not to go. Go back! Don't walk out into the swamp! Stay awake all night with your back against the wall. In the swamp, she meets Pearson, and he says he heard someone calling her name.
Pearson, it's you.
Miss Leslie, did you hear your name being called?
What did you say?
Yes, ma'am.
What do you mean, yes, ma'am? Did you hear voices calling my name?
Yes, ma'am, I sure did.
You heard them. You heard them. And they're really there.
Yes, Miss Leslie. They say this place is haunted. But you shouldn't be rambling around in the dark like this, Miss Leslie.
Well, what are you doing here?
I gotta find out. And when I do, I'll let you know. I'll let you know tomorrow, maybe. I'll go up to the house, and then I'll know. But there's one thing I do know, Miss Leslie. They're after you because they're calling your name, and you better get back into the house right this minute.
All right, Pearson, I'll go, but...
There's the path there, Miss Leslie. I'll watch you from here until you're safe back to the house.
Leslie. He says he will find out what's going on. Pearson says they are after her and she should go back to the house. Back in the house, Leslie tries to call George, but has to leave a message. Leslie goes to Emily's room and asks about Mr. Sidney and Cleve. She rats Pearson out for hearing the voices too. Emily says that her and Leslie's mother used to go dancing all the time. Leslie knows that Emily is lying. Cleve stalks Leslie's attempt to contact George. Pearson slinks around the edge of the property and talks to Leslie. He says she is in danger and that Emily and Norbert are not her aunt and uncle. She asks Pearson to meet her in the bayou that night. When she gets to the sugar mill, Pearson has been murdered and is laying by the bayou. This is kind of like Scatman Carruthers' role in The Shining, 1980. Give the warning and get killed. Leslie runs blindly through the swamp until she runs into Cleve.
Hi. Taking a walk? Hot, isn't it? Well, nights like this were made for sleeping anyway. You might get hurt walking around the woods alone. When's your doctor friend coming around again? You go for him, don't you? You know, you and I could have a lot of fun together if you just be yourself for a minute.
He is creepy as ever. He follows her back to the house. She gets money and plans to catch a train out of Belleville. She is stopped in the hall by Emily and Norbert. She sees Mr. Sidney waiting downstairs. She sneaks out, but is trapped between Cleve and Emily on the porch. She returns to her room knowing she is a prisoner. In the morning, Florella is missing. Leslie is on guard, but there's nothing she can do. Finally, the phone rings and it's George. She invites him out. He says he will be out that evening, and she says, "See you in an hour." Leslie waits for George while the rest of the gang stays close by. George arrives in the afternoon. She rapid fires the story to George, and she sounds crazy. Mr. Sidney overhears the conversation. George doesn't believe her. He gives her a prescription and says he will be back the next afternoon. Leslie seems like she has lost the battle. George tells everything to Mr. Sidney. When she gets back to her room, Leslie reads a prescription, and it is a note from George saying that they were being listened to and he will be back to help her and he loves her. George lays it on thick with Mr. Sidney about how fragile Leslie is and that she must be moved to a hospital. Mr. Sidney hitches a ride with George to the field office. That night, Mr. Sidney, Emily, and Norbert are downstairs. Norbert starts to renegotiate the deal as Emily calls him Pinky and he calls her May. Emily pretends that she didn't know Leslie was going to be hurt. They try and quit the scam. Mr. Sidney says there's no getting out now. He also says he has murdered the Lamonts, Leslie's real aunt and uncle. Finally, Mr. Sidney orders May to bring Leslie down. Cleve is out in the swamp at the sugar mill. He is drinking heavily and has George tied up to a grindstone. George starts to get into Cleve's head.
You do everything Sidney says?
I got a mind of my own.
Yeah, what happened to Leslie?
I reckon I could guess. But I won't.
Same thing that happened to the real Lamonts?
Maybe.
They're out in the bayou under the water hyacinths. Why are you afraid of Sidney?
You and me? Afraid?
Mm-hmm.
I ain't afraid of nobody.
I notice you do all the dirty work, don't you?
What dirty work?
Well, I can't see Sidney pulling the trigger or sticking the knife. With you to do it for him, why should he soil his lily white hands?
Mr. Sidney shows up with Leslie. Mr. Sidney takes Cleve's booze away, and the small seeds that George has planted are growing. Of course, in the grand tradition of bad guys, Mr. Sidney explains his plan to George. George starts asking him if he's going to cut Pinky, May, and Cleve in on the money. Cleve starts getting paranoid. Mr. Sidney has Cleve untie George and put him and Leslie in a boat. George keeps working on the drunk Cleve. They drive out to the middle of the swamp. On the side of the boat, it says Higgins' boat. So I have to put the murder on hold and go off on a side story. During World War II, the military began looking for a shallow draft boat that could be used to make beach landings. They found Andrew Higgins in New Orleans. He made shallow draft boats for timber and oil business, or perhaps liquor smuggling in the spirit of Jean Lafitte in the shallow swamps of Louisiana. Although not a successful businessman, he was said to pay and promote regardless of race and sex. That's pretty unique for the 1930s in the rural South. Anyway, he got the contract by 1938 and made the famous boats that took our troops ashore from D-Day to Okinawa and everywhere in between. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, said of Higgins and his boats, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built the LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." So, if you're ever in New Orleans, go to Andrew Higgins Boulevard and see where the factory was located. What you'll find there is the National World War II Museum, and it's worth your time. Damn Nazis. Anyway, there was a movie being summarized. Cleve says he won't do the killing. He makes Mr. Sidney throw his gun overboard.
I won't do it.
What's that?
I won't do it unless...
Unless what?
I'm not taking any chances on you pulling a fast one, Sidney.
A fast one?
You know what I mean.
My dear boy, you're not going to take what this fellow said seriously.
There's only going to be one gun in this boat, Sidney. Mine.
That's telling him, please.
Shut up, you. Put your revolver over the side and let go of it.
Dr. Groover, you poisoned this boy's mind. I'm tempted to do this job on you myself.
As soon as he moves, George attacks the two men. Leslie and George jump overboard and hide in the lily pads. Mr. Sidney shoots, but to no avail. Cleve runs over them. But hey, shallow bottom boat. Leslie is bumped, but okay. George manages to get her ashore with Mr. Sidney still firing at them. Cleve and Mr. Sidney go ashore. Eventually, Cleve starts screaming and runs blindly into the swamp. He falls into quicksand.
I'm stuck. Give me a hand, will you? I'm sinking. I'm in quicksand.
Don't struggle. You can't get out by yourself.
Please, God help me. Don't shoot me, Mr. Sidney. Help me. Help me.
As a child, didn't you think quicksand would be a bigger problem? Anyway, Mr. Sidney lets him die rather than give the gun to George. George says he is the only one that knows the way out of the swamp. George bluffs Mr. Sidney into giving up his gun. George takes him out at gunpoint. Leslie drives the boat and George tells her there's nothing to be afraid of now. She says she is all right and smiles. Is this film noir? Using the 7 elements described by Dr. Edwards in a film noir class I took, I will look at this film and determine which elements work and which do not. In the end, I will make a determination whether this film should be classified as film noir or not. Element 1, post-war anxiety and societal malaise. It has this after Leslie's experience with the U-boat. Element 2, guilt and dread. Leslie feels that she should be with her parents and has a general foreboding. Element 3, psychoanalysis and trauma. It has this as they all try to get inside Leslie's head. Element 4, criminality and the limits of rational investigation. Criminals, check. Femme fatale, no. Element 5, existential despair. Leslie is trapped and doesn't know what to fear. Element 6, the inability to separate truth from lies. It has this. Element 7, the role of women in post-war society. Not so much, but it has the lighting, the shadows, the criminal, despair, hopelessness, moral ambiguity, smoking, but not enough. It doesn't have cops, detectives, or femme fatales. but I would say it has its feet across the film noir line. World famous short summary: girl takes a long boat trip and meets a nice boy. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I really appreciate you spending the time listening. You can find connections to social media and email on my site at classicmovierev.com. There are links in the podcast show notes as well. Remember, this show is completely free and independent. All that I ask is that you jump over to Apple Podcast and give me a review. It really helps the show get found. Beware the Moors.
Let's be frank. You never wanted to give me a review on iTunes. You come to me this day, on the day of my daughter's wedding, and you ask me, give me a movie review. But you never come to my house in friendship. You never wanted to drink coffee with me. Had you gone to iTunes and given me a review, this day I would give you a movie review.